Hello. Welcome back to the Educated Calls Snap channel. How you doing? So today we're going to be talking about just an issue I've been thinking about with some of the patch changes and stuff, and that's going to be the issue of planning with the balance cycle, how it's very different. So let's get started. All right, so let's get into it. So this essentially what I want to do in this video is kind of just talk about just a feeling I've been getting, and it's obviously been exasperated by this recent patch where Mobius got changed. And I do know a lot of players got Mobius, a lot of players were expecting to be using this card, expecting it to be a very powerful card for their future. And now they have like a card they can't really play. Now, in a different like economy, in a different world, it wouldn't be too bad. Like, yeah, you lost a card, but because cards are the way they are, expensive, limited, stuff like that, it is a real concern. So I'm just gonna go over some points that I had with the Marvel Snap balance cycle, and then we're just gonna go through it. So first thing off, obviously, is new cards are expensive, right? Some of the older cards, Series 3 and under, they're not, right? You'll get them eventually. But the new cards you are spending a lot of resources on, especially if you're a new player, right? These things can be lots of spotlights, caches, which you can really only get one a week, maybe five a month at best if you're free to play or spending very limited, like only season pass. Same thing with the tokens. Tokens are now very rare to get, so it takes a while to accumulate enough tokens to get like a Series 5 card, 6,000 tokens. That is a lot of months of resource generally to get that much at this moment. And then if you're buying bundles and stuff, bundles are expensive. I think that goes without saying, right? Like some of these bundles are just very expensive. So just new cards are expensive, but as well as them being expensive, they're also limited. So you don't get to choose whatever new card you want. You don't get to say, hey, I want this new card. I'm going to get it today, right? No, that's not what happens. You have a week to make your decision. Every week, you have to make the decision, do I want this card or not, right? Do I want to use my resources on this card, or do I want to save it for an even better card, save it for a card that, fits my playstyle, etc. And if you say no, you don't want this card, then you're going to have to wait a month plus to have it roll around again. So it's not even like, hey, you want the new card, you can get it. All right. If you want X23 right now, like, what do you do? What are you gonna do? No, you're nothing. You're just gonna wait until it rolls around, or you're gonna spend months acquiring 6,000 tokens. You don't really have other options, and this is a decision you have to make every single week for all the new cards, except for the Series Pass week. That one usually has an old card that you can kind of skip, but generally, you do have to kind of make these decisions. So that all culminates with the perceived power of cards. So it's not that all cards are really equal. So when you come to a decision of like, which cards am I going to go for, there are some that are more appealing than others, right? Like some feel stronger, some have more obvious synergies and things like that. So it's not that one card is equal to another card, willy nilly. If you throw a dart and you pick whatever the dart chooses, will you be happy with your choices? Probably not, because some cards you just need, or some cards are just really valuable to have in your collection, where others are just not the case. So the power level of cards differ wildly. Now, even though the power level of cards differ wildly, the power level of cards during its release period and after it's been through a couple of patches also differ wildly. So here I have a picture of like my September season card review when it was in the data mines, right? And the data mines didn't really change from release, right? So these cards were, the data mine cards was also the same as them in release, right? But now we have like, we've seen the cards through a couple of patches, and almost every card in here is changed. They're different in some way, and my thoughts, my opinions of the cards will change. There's something that I can remember distinctly. There was definitely some article that was kind of judging or gauging the opinion of everyone's thoughts on the cards before they were released, right? And I believe what happened was Mobius was number one, Ravona was last, something like that, right? And like that, I feel like that was maybe accurate. Like you could argue like Loki is number one, right? And then Mobius is like maybe even third. Like Alliance on release was maybe stronger, right? So honestly, the overall the community that was during the article didn't really have like the super correct, but they were in the right ballpark for sure. But now if you were to like do it now, right, Ravona I think is a lot better than some of these other options here. And that was definitely not true during its release period. So even during September now, our thoughts of these cards have changed due to the patches, due to adjustments, due to nerfs, buffs, whatever. But it just showcases like the power level of a card during its release cycle and during after it's been through the live testing, it's been through the live nerfs or buffs, right? It can drastically change your opinion of a card. So there are cards that will just be underutilized, underplayed, and they can become amazing from patch to patch just through the adjustments, right? So there's a card like Negasonic Teenage Warhead. I don't have this card right now, right? And I shouldn't have this card, honestly, in my opinion. However, they buffed her, and I think now she's very playable. So it's but now if I wanted to get this card, I can't, right? I have to wait until it comes up, which of course intentionally it's coming up soon, but it's just like, hey, a patch comes, now the meta is very different. A card you might have not gotten intentionally, strategically, is now a card you might want to be getting. So that's it's just hard to plan around that, right? Like in terms of like the main thoughts of this piece is it's hard to plan, right? Because let's say you were planning, okay, this card we can skip, this card we should get, this card we can skip. Now our patch changes, and the card you should get is now the card you should skip, and the card you should skip is now the card you should get. But you've already spent the resources, and the time has passed, the limited window to acquire the card is gone, and you have to be waiting, and you're out of resources. So it's like, what to do, right? Like, how do you plan strategically when these options are available? And that's kind of the issue I'm having. Reason why I'm making this video. Those type of things is just hard to grasp as a person that likes to plan strategic, use my strategies in terms of like making sure I'm not wasting my resources. This type of thing is like very concerning. So that's something I wanted to mention. Next up, we do have this notion that players are encouraged to spend quickly, right? So you have a week essentially to kind of make your decisions in terms of bundles, in terms of token shop, in terms of the spotlights, right? You're not really, you don't really have the fullest control of like, hey, I want this variant. How can I get this variant? You gotta buy it between the weeks of November 22nd to November 29th. And then if you don't get it, they're gone forever. Like it's like, okay. For a variant, like it's that drastic. Same thing with the spotlights, right? If you want the spotlight, you gotta get it within that window or it's gone, right? So it's just encouraging players to spend quickly to kind of shell if they can, and there's not really any way to kind of go back and make a readjustment or like, hey, I actually wanted this card instead of that card. Can I get it now? No, like you have to wait until it comes up. So it's just kind of a nature of how Second Editor wants to do it. It's kind of almost necessary with the way their economy works. You have to have a reason to spend, and if you have that full freedom, then you don't really have to spend unless you absolutely need to. So this system is kind of required with the way that Second Dinner wants to monetize, to kind of encourage people to spend quickly and make it have a little bit of a a FOMO mentality, I guess. So something to mention. There's also no refunds or no ways to change your opinions, right? Same thing with spending quickly. Even if you spend recklessly, right, you just buy all the cards or like buy all the spotlight variants. I would say like that's maybe super reckless, right? You spend 8 spotlight caches to get a particular variant, and you're unhappy with that purchase. There's no way to recover your resources. I personally can understand this approach. I think it's with all the changes they do. If there was always ways to recover the resources, or you could always just like buy a card and then return it and buy a card and return it, right? Like there's no way to really have an economy that works for them, or economy that makes them any money, and then the game would shut down, right? So it's not, it's understandable that they have this approach. I do think sometimes if they make mistakes, like where I would say this Mobius change is a mistake, where it's just not in the right direction, having a refund policy in those scenarios might make sense. So it's definitely something to keep in mind, but it is something that players have to deal with, not having any way of refunding if they change their mind or their opinion, anything like that. All right, so this is like one of the main gripes I have with the balance philosophy at the moment, is that let even if you make the right decision at the time, you know, day by day, you're like, okay, this is correct. Due to the nature of how powerful balance changes can be, getting the best card at release might not always be the best use of resources, right? Like, so let's say you know, in September you wanted to get the Goliath, right? Bam. Well, Goliath got nerfed. I wouldn't say it's bad, but it's definitely less played, and it definitely doesn't feel as necessary as it was on release, right? So let's say you're playing in September, you see you lose to Goliath constantly. You're like, this card is crazy. You buy it, and then soon after it gets nerfed. Well, that and now it's not as necessary to be playing, right? You don't see as many people playing Goliath anymore, even though it's still playable, but you know, it's definitely not played anymore at the level it was before. That decision to get Goliath, I would say, is correct. Like, that card was crazy. Like, you should get it. You'd be in trouble if you didn't have any way to deal with it, right? But now, I wouldn't necessarily, like, if you told me, should I get Goliath now? Like, I would be like, probably not. Like, you don't need it, you know? So, due to the nature of the power of balance changes, those correct decisions aren't always going to be correct, right? You might want to say, hey, this card is very strong. It's going to be nerfed. I shouldn't get it. But now I can't play the game because this strong card is killing me every match, and I can't play the same deck to kind of deal with that matchup, right? But I know this card is getting nerfed, so I shouldn't buy it, right? Like, so it kind of puts you in a weird spot where you see a strong card, and now you kind of have to think, is this getting nerfed? Should I get it? Is it getting nerfed? You see a very weak card, you have to start thinking, this card's going to get buffed. Like, at some point, maybe I should buy it, right? Because if it gets buffed, I don't have it, I might be behind. So it just puts this weird mentality where you see a good card and you have to kind of hold off, wait, you know, and see whether it gets changed. So it it just creates this very weird cycle where you want to make the right decisions, you want to get the strong cards, but due to the nature of balance changes, those might not always be the right decisions long term, right? And that just feels really weird to me as a content creator as well. Like, if I'm like, hey, you should get Goliath, this card is crazy, and then a week later it's like, this card sucks now. Like, you should, why'd you listen to me? Like, it's just like, no, I don't like that. So that's definitely something I do think needs to be adjusted in some way. Make sure they're the difficulty is like, you need to be getting the balance right at the first iteration, and that is just too hard to do. Honestly, I like it is definitely a difficult thing to do to get it right initially, but you do have to be at least closer, right? And you can't destroy the essence of the card, right? With balance changes, which is sometimes what happens. um, New cards are just leaning to be overpowered than underpowered. This one is just almost necessary because if the card's not popular, secondary just can't make any money from the card, right? So it's just better for a card, for them at least, to be overpowered than underpowered, right? You'd argue maybe it's better for I don't know if what is better for players. Like obviously better for players is a balance, right? But like if you're going to lean one way, it's I mean it's more healthy for players for it to be underpowered, but it's not healthy for second dinner to be underpowered, right? Because you need cards to be interesting, exciting, want to be purchased, right? So due to that, like this is just the nature of their economy. Cards do need to be overpowered. It just kind of sucks that it creates these cycles where every time you see the data mines and stuff like that, it's like, oh wow, all these cards are crazy, and then after they get released, right, in their crazy form, the paying players will get to play with it, and then the free to play players will wait and see, and then the paying players will be like, wow, this card is crazy, I climbed so much with it, and then the free to play players are like, yeah, I've been losing to this, let me get the card. So then they get the card, and then secondary is like, this card is crazy. Let me nerf it. And then the paying players are like, yeah, that's fine. They just released another new broken card. I'm gonna use that instead. And then the free to play players are like, my Mobius is trash. I spent all my resources on this. So it's just a weird cycle. Unfortunately. And I don't necessarily know if there's like a good answer on other than like better balancing initially, right? But once again, that's very hard. So it just it's just kind of a nature of the economy that you have to be very selective of the cards you get, and when you pick up a card, especially a free play player, you have to be confident that it's going to continue to be strong, right? And with the nature of the patches, it's hard to have that confidence. It's hard to feel like super sure that, hey, I'm using my month resource on this card. This card will be strong. This card I can play matchup against the other players with, So what to do, right? What to do? What's next here? Ah, yes, the bundles, right? Like you you cannot, I would say this is not okay, it's very understandable for players that bought this form and function bundle to be upset right now. Like if you bought this bundle, you're like, hey, Mobius is strong, I want to spend all my gold on this, and then this patch comes out and you're just like, what was the point of this bundle? Like this bundle was okay, but you needed to get Mobius to justify paying this price for this bundle. Otherwise, in my opinion, there were way better bundles coming out that were at this price point. So if a person bought this bundle and they see this patch and their Mobius is dead, not really wanting to be played, well, like it makes sense that they're angry. It makes sense that they're not gonna buy a bundle like this ever again, because this can happen, and this can generally happen regardless, right? Like the card you buy, but the fact that it happens so soon after you buy it just hurts a lot more, right? Like you had to wait 2 weeks before after it comes out to buy this, then hey, you get to play it for a couple of weeks and then it's dead. Like it's and it takes like 3-4 months to save that much amount of gold. Essentially, you get around 2K a month if you're free to play. So this is around 3 to 4 months of savings if you're a free to play player to get this. So you're like, okay, I'm going to use my resources here, get the new card that's very strong in the meta, and then hopefully it's worth it, right? And then boom, like it's not, So um, I do think if Mobius doesn't get adjusted very quickly or changes in a quick way, like I hope there is some compensation, I would say, for the people that bought this bundle generally, and just in general. We'll talk about it in my suggestions near the end, but that is something I do think um, should be kept in mind when you're making these changes, right? Especially if it is the card that is spotlighted in a bundle, right? Like, so not all cards have these type of bundles, right? Like, but Mobius was like a very hype card. and normally like there was like Stegron bundle, right? Like that card didn't get any hype. No one talked about it because it's like, yeah, this card, it's not important. But here, this was a very important card. Some people chose to skip it to get it through this bundle, and now they're getting, very punished. So it just feels pretty bad for them. And with all that in mind, right? I've been talking generically. I do want to have a little bit of specifics here, and we want to talk about Mobius and Loki, right? Loki, I think, as you've seen if you play the game, is very effective right now, very strong. It was strong at the beginning of September, and then we were all assuming Mobius was the counter, the justification of Loki being so strong that, hey, you're going to have Mobius as a counter to deal with it. But now that I've played through that meta, I do think that philosophy is flawed. You can't create a broken card and then create the counter of that broken card and say, yes, it's fine because we have the counter. Well, then everyone has to play the counter. Otherwise, that broken card just dominates the meta. And then if anything happens to the broken card, hey, look, the Loki just starts dominating again. So you just need to make sure both the counter and the broken card are just balanced, right? So once again, Loki, why is it a 5 power? Why is it 5 power? I still don't understand why its power is so high. But going back to the topic, right? Mobius was kind of created to justify the existence of Loki. But now that Mobius is kind of dead, not viable enough to be played in decks, you just have Loki once again running around, once again dominating, once again being a nuisance. Some people obviously like Loki, but even those players do agree that, hey, Loki is very strong and maybe too strong, right? It needs to be adjusted in some way. Now, speaking of Loki and Mobius, this also brings another specific one. It's the cost reduction issue. So cost reduction is such a powerful effect in any card game I've ever played ever, right? And it's very common in Snap, honestly. The ability to make cards cost different amounts, less, more, blah, blah, blah. It's very common in this game. And there's a lot of tools to do it. And Mobius generally is only powerful because of all the cost reduction in the game. If there was nobody playing cost reduction, like Mobius doesn't matter, right? Like it's not that impactful of a card if you're not into any cost reduction decks. But because it's so prevalent, there's so many people playing cost reduction effects, it's just easy for it to be an auto include in the game because cost reduction is so strong and everyone's running some form of it. It's so easy to just slot this card in as a 2-drop that saves you in some matchups. So it's just like Mobius could not be an issue in itself if there wasn't that many usable common cost reduction cards. But because there's so many, that's very easy to have one or multiple of them in your deck. It's just like, hey, like if Mobius isn't in the meta, all of these get to shine, all of these get to do whatever they want. And I would definitely take a look at cost reduction effects in essence and whether you want that many, that freely, and that easy to use in the meta game. So that's just something I would be aware of because it's like very common, right? Like if Mobius, if this wasn't a problem, Mobius wouldn't matter, right? Like it's like, okay, Mobius shuts down Loki, but it's not that much of an issue. That's all it does, right? But because everyone's using cost reduction, it's like, well, Mobius shuts down like half the decks in the game, right? So it's just something to take a look at. Should we have this many? Should they be so powerful? That kind of thing, etc. Now, the issue, like some people would say, just put Mobius to the same power level, right? Like just bring Mobius ongoing, shuts down all cost reduction effects, right? Like the issue is that Mobius is too strong. I actually think it's not healthy to have Mobius in its current form because it just means that so many decks are unplayable because everyone's running Mobius and it counters like half the decks, right? So it makes sense to run a card that counters half the decks. But it's still the nature of the change is you killed off Mobius, and I think that's where people get angry, right? Like no one can really justify playing Mobius with its current change, and that's where you have the issue. So I do think even though Mobius is too strong, it needs to be effective. It needs to have a use case, and right now it doesn't. So I would just hope that there are some adjustments to Mobius. I'm like so sure there are, honestly. Like I'm so sure Mobius is getting another change. But it just shouldn't have this first change should not have happened, right? Like there should have been like better playtesting or something so that this first change didn't go through. Um, but yeah, the nature of the change combined with the wave change creates limited answers. And wave is another change as well that is in part also combined with this Mobius change, right? So cost reduction had some answers with wave. You could wave on the last turn to kind of shut down all this cost reduction things, and I think that was actually a good countermeasure tool. I was actually okay with that, but during the patch they said like they were not happy that wave was being used in that manner, which I was surprised about. Right, I would thought that they'd be aware that it's being used in that manner and it's a common tool, but apparently they didn't like it. So this change, this Mobius nerf plus the wave change means that cost reduction is just running rampant. It's very easy to do. There's no real answers to it. So I just think that hey, you gotta have some ways to deal with cost reduction if it's gonna be so prevalent. And right now there isn't really a way except for Sandman, which is not a popular card to be using as a tech tool and also affects you in a heavy way, right? You have to build very specifically to deal with the Sandman effect. So something they have was the developer's note for Mobius, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there are some things that um, are indicative of their balanced philosophy and something I wanted to mention. First off, I do want to say I'm very happy they provided, right? Like communication sometimes is a double-edged sword where you you want to be helpful, you want to tell players your ideas, but sometimes they'll be like, "Oh, this idea was bad," right? Or this idea we don't like and we're going to, let you know, right? So, um definitely happy they are mentioning it, but there are some things that are concerning, right? First of all is um they expect, well, the main thing is that they said they expected to make an adjustment down the road on Mobius in order to welcome cost reduction strategies back into the limelight, right? So they made this card very strong, right? And it seems like they knew it was very strong because they were aware they had to make an adjustment down the road, right? And I feel like that type of philosophy is just inherently flawed, right? You don't want to be putting out cards that are once again expensive and limited, assuming that, oh, I'm going to nerf this card heavily down the line so that other strategies can shine, right? And it's they essentially said they're creating temporary play metas, right? With some of their new cards, some of their adjustments, and then adjusting them back into like a balanced state or so. They said they're interested to hear our feedback on their approach using a new card as a tool to create a temporary play environment. I do think they've gotten a lot of feedback, so I'm not going to hammer it home here, but definitely with the way the economy works, you can't do this with new cards. Um, I think personally, and one of my suggestions is fine to do it with older cards, but when it comes to new cards, they have to be consistent. Like if you're buying the card, you have to be able to play with them. And if you make it a temporary play pattern where you release it broken and nerf it into, viability or so, like that is not healthy for the player base because it feels like they're getting a little bit scammed, right? Where they think they're getting something, but then they're not, and they're not getting this in the future, right? You're going to adjust this card in the future, even like soon after release, very soon after looking at the data. That's like, maybe like that is not something you want to ever be doing. So hopefully they hear their feedback and they just adjust. But I'm happy that they're telling us that this is what they're doing. It's just this one in particular was not the right way to balance things, right? Shouldn't be creating temporary play patterns with cards that are very hard to get and limited in scope, right? So something to say. Next thing I want to talk about is just patch timing issues. So the the way patches are done is they're done in advance, and then the patch can't really react to meta because they're done way in advance, right? They said here that they build their patches about a month in advance. So basically, this Mobius change was probably locked in months or not months, but like weeks in advance at least, right? So it's hard. It's hard for them because let's say you have your data for the week, right? And then you see like Mobius is in like 90% of decks and it's destroying the viability of like 30-40% of other archetypes being played at all, right? Like they just all disappear, right? Then you see that you're like, okay, we have to nerf Mobius, right? And you're like, okay, we got to do it big, right? This card is 90% played. That's insane, right? So they make this change, they ship it, right? It's in the works. And then the patch like gets more healthy over time. People adjust, right? Mobius is less played, but because they already have this patch locked in, right? Once it comes out, right, it's like, what are we doing? Like, this doesn't make any sense at the time, right? So that's kind of the issue. I would say OTAs are better, right? OTAs are weak, so that's a little bit more on the ball. But these patches definitely can be very different than what the community is expecting because of how early they get locked in. So I don't know if there's a way to solve that in their current design flow, but patches being finalized long in advance can cause issues like so where it doesn't react to the meta. They're out of tune, they add a touch and they just don't feel appropriate compared to like the OTAs, which are very in tune with the meta, very accurate, right? Those kind of things. So I don't know if there's a way to do that because patches definitely require more like little things, right? You're doing VFXs, you're doing a lot of other nerfs, buffs, you're adding those spotlight keys, There's so many little things that are being added that it's hard to also make sure the balance is on tune. So I don't know if there's a good way of doing it in their current schedule, but it's just something to be aware of when you're doing these patches. Like, oh, we might be not on the nose, right, in terms of our changes. So just something there. And I just want to talk about communication in general, right? Just sometimes, it's hard to communicate, right? Like, it's not good to always be super. Well, I'm not gonna say that, but it's not good to tell everyone everything, right? Like generally, right? People don't necessarily care about the nuance with a lot of things. So, but it's good to talk to players in good faith, right? Like try to tell them, hey, this is what we're doing, this is our ideas. I do think like in terms of the Mobius adjustment, if you, since the patches are locked months or like weeks in advance, if you were to tell the players, hey, we're thinking about adjusting these cards, right? Mobius is one of them, right? Our data showed it was very very prevalent, so just be aware that this might happen, right? Like I think the reaction to this change would be a little bit lower. I don't think it would necessarily be gone or anything like that, but I do think if people were expecting, hey, Mobius might not be as dominating as as right now in 2 weeks time, right? Like I think that would be a little bit better, and just like having more communication in terms of like the things people care about in terms of like balance adjustments would just be helpful to kind of lessen the impact. Just be aware, and also help players plan more, right? Because this game is almost like a planning game half of the time, where you're just making sure you're getting the right cards at the right time to to guide. So just more information on how to plan better is always good. So this is just something I just want to mention. And then just overall thoughts. We've been here for a while, and hopefully, Second Inner sees some of the feedback. I'm sure they see some of the stuff in Discord or so. Maybe not Reddit as much, but definitely Discord and maybe some of their you know people are listening in. Da, 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 da. I just think right now it's hard to plan correctly. So when I'm looking at the spotlights for this month, right? Like I'm thinking like which ones make sense, what's likely to get nerfed. Like I actually have to think about that now, which I just like why, and good decisions that have become poor decisions due to balance changes is a concerning thought. I just think that shouldn't really ever be true. Where you make a good decision, but because of the whims of balance, it becomes a bad decision. It's a lot harder when it's a good like it's kind of fine when it's a bad card becoming good, but when it's a good card becoming like very bad or significantly less when it was like overbearingly good, that's where things feel really bad because you're spending those hard-earned resources. If you're not spending the resources on the card, then it's like a little bit fine. Like, yeah, okay, Ravona is a lot better, but yeah, I didn't spend the money. Da, 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 da. But when it's like, hey, I bought Mobius and I bought the Mobius bundle and now it's dead, like that kind of stuff just feels very, very bad. So I just hope they could get better at that, just work on their balancing a little bit better so that those things don't happen in the future. But that's definitely for me like something that I find concerning, right? If I bought, um, I don't know, what's a card like Eliath, right? Like if I spend all my resources on Eliath, and now it's like I don't really want it right now. Like those kind of things just feel kind of bad, and it's also weird to have to wait to get a newly buffed card since they were a weekend release, right? Like right now, um, I think Negasonic's really good, right? But I don't see it at all because no one has it or something. I don't really see the card, but I think it's really good, and I would love to get the card right now. However, it's not in my token shop. It's not in the spotlight. It's like I have no way of getting the card until I wait. So it's just like kind of weird that like, hey, they buffed the card, but no, you still can't get it until it shows up in the spotlight. So just kind of a weird feeling. Like, how do you plan for these patches that can make um cards extremely viable or cards unplayable, right? Like there's no real easy way to plan for that kind of thing. So those are just some thoughts I have about the balance cycle. Just like overall, a little bit concerned. I do think they'll see this feedback and get improvement. Not my feedback, but just feedback in general and get improvements. But it's just something that I was thinking about, something I wanted to make. And then I usually try to have suggestions at the end. That's just my general thoughts. If I'm making a feedback, I always want to put suggestions. I don't really have many here because I think the the problems are hard or a little bit nuanced in that they're not it's not just balance, right? Like you also have to think about like profitability and stuff like that, and moving forward, right? How to continue, having a healthy cycle, stuff like that, right? I think in terms of Mobius in particular, right? You definitely want to readjust Mobius and compensate for the bundle Mobius purchase. So I say where you don't have to compensate if you readjust quickly. However, people are mad, right? And I always feel like if people are mad, give them some compensation, shut them up. That's just my kind of take. You could say like, you're feeding into the madness, but generally sometimes it's good to just build trust again through giving them what they want, and people want tokens and gold, right? So yeah, that thing I think is something you don't have to, honestly, as long as you readjust Mobius into a playable state, right? Like now, um, communicating balance thoughts when they're finalized, right? So since the patches in particular, especially since patches quite a long time before they're released, it's helpful to kind of give that information to players in terms of like not exactly what you're changing, but like, hey, we're thinking about adjusting these 5 cards, like in some way, right? Like that might help some players plan better and just like make better decisions if they know, oh, okay, they're Mobius is too strong. Yeah, we all know that, right? But at least we know the guarantee it's getting an adjustment in this in some way. Not exactly what is being adjusted or what it is, but like it's going to get touched in some way. And then in terms of this temporary play environment, so this was something interesting, right? They said that this is an idea, a philosophy they're having. Maybe not a philosophy is too strong, but this is an idea that they're doing where they're trying to create temporary play environments by making some cards strong and then seeing how it feels and adjusting afterwards, right? I think if you're gonna do that, you don't do that for series 5 or 4 cards or no new cards. Essentially, you do that for series 3 or lower cards, right? Especially series 2 and under. Those cards could definitely be adjusted in multiple ways, right? There's a lot of those that are like just sitting there doing nothing, right? So I think if you're going to do that type of philosophy, do it for cards that a lot of people have access to and isn't like super expensive to get. It also wouldn't feel horrible if it gets removed, right? Like if it's a card where you're spending 6,000 tokens for and then it gets removed like that, like it's just a horrible thing. So I just would not do that type of philosophy for those expensive cards, right? Leave that type of changes for those cards that a lot of people have access to. So that would be my thoughts. But overall, yeah. Here we go, another 40-minute banger. What am I doing? But yeah, what are your guys' thoughts? Obviously, and take care of yourselves and have a wonderful rest of your day. And I'll see you in the next one. I'm trying to. We should have the spotlight soon. So and then the bundle analysis, all that stuff. It should be coming out soon. Patch day is a busy day.
Educated calling snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to marvel snap. Your skills will be improving. How you do